Welcome to Conversations on the Coast, San Francisco's premier author interview program. Today we are going to talk about a book called Final Exam, A Surgeon's Reflections on Mortality. The surgeon reflecting on the mortality is Dr. Pauline Chen, and her book is published by Alfred A. Knopf, and I'm very glad you stopped by.
Thank you for having me.
I do want to let everybody know that you just didn't get into this business. You've been at it a while. You are indeed a liver transplant surgeon practicing somewhere on the East Coast. Boston, I think?
I'm living outside of Boston.
Outside of Boston. You once had the sense to practice here, and then something happened, and you went back there. And you attended Harvard University and the Feinberg School of Medicine at Northwestern, completed surgical training at Yale University. You went all over the place. And then you also trained at the National Cancer Institute of the NIH and also at UCLA, where she was most recently a member of the faculty in 1999. Dr. Chen was named the UCLA Outstanding Physician of the Year. And in addition to all that, you were kind of, with your left hand, if you will, developing your skill, capacity, and interest in being a writer.
Yes.
How did you do all that?
Well,
Coincidentally, we have two children?
Yes.
Twins.
4.5-year-old twins.
The rest of us are sitting here saying, what are we doing with our lives? Doing nothing. I'm sorry. Let's get back to this. You were, at the same time all this was going on, you were working on your skills as a writer, publishing short stories. That
really sort of came at the end of all the training. The training was quite difficult, and given the choice between eating and sleeping or writing, I chose the eating and the sleeping. But I've always liked to write.
I like a sensible woman.
So at the end of the training, I started to write stories, and they were at first fictional short stories. But then I took a couple of courses at UCLA, writing courses, in the hopes that it would help harness some of these writing impulses, because I found myself writing and writing and writing everywhere. And halfway through one of the courses, the teacher asked to speak to me, and she said to me that afternoon, she said, "Pauline, you have to write these stories." And I think that gave me the permission to write what I really wanted to write, which were the stories of patients I had cared for over the last 10 to 15 years.
And writing about those patients in a certain context. The context, I would say, is trying to answer a very difficult question. Why are physicians not more competent in caring for the dying? And to that tough question, you give several answers.
Yeah, what I try to do in this book is look at that question primarily through the perspective of one doctor, myself, and look at why I believe most other doctors, because I don't think we go to medical school wanting to depersonalize the experience or to be distant from our patients. I think most of us go there wanting to help our patients. But somehow in the course of training, which is terrific in some ways. I mean, in this country, we produce very competent doctors, technically competent doctors. But somewhere in that process, we end up farther away from our patients, less able to do what we started out wanting so badly to do. And so I look at that journey from my own perspective.
Yes. The interesting thing is that what really comes across is that it's difficult to have a perspective because you're under the crush of all the obligations and all the courses and all the stuff you're supposed to know and spit back in exams and then, carry forward as a doctor. It's like, so when the heck is a person supposed to have the time to reflect on what perhaps is a role of the doctor that nobody wants to think about?
Right. It's very difficult. And especially in the last 15, 20 years, there has been an explosion of knowledge of medical advances. And students have to know all of that, and they have to learn about how to be a caring physician. Unfortunately, that latter thing often gets pushed aside. But I would say that one thing that I'm very optimistic about is that that there have been efforts at reform over the last 20 years. Some wonderful experts in end-of-life care have really pushed for changes. So, and there have been efforts to relook, to redo the medical education system or rethink it. You know, the paradigm that we have right now is not working, and it's certainly not working under the load of information that doctors have to learn. So there are people out there trying to change things. That being said, however, we still have a long ways to go.
Last Exam is full of descriptions of medical procedures and practices, but it is written with restrained but impassioned prose. And I'm going to prove that to you when we come back.
You're listening to Conversations on the Coast with Jim Foster. Now you can find this program on iTunes, SoundCloud, and all your favorite digital outlets. Follow the show on Twitter at JimFosterCoc and email JimFosterCoc@gmail.com.
Dr. Pauline Chen is the guest. Final Exam, A Surgeon's Reflections on Mortality. That's the title of the book. The publisher is Alfred Knopf. And Publishers Weekly had some nice things to say about the book. In part, Chen writes with immaculately honed prose and moral passion as she recounts her quest to overcome, quote, lessons in denial and depersonalization. You were talking about that in the first segment, denial and depersonalization around the whole issue of death. Vividly evoking the paradoxes of end-of-life care in an age of life-preserving treatments. And that's got to produce a lot of tension. Preserve. Oh, one of the phrases you use later in the book, aggressive what?
Therapy,
yeah.
Yes.
At all costs to beyond the very end.
I think it's been wonderful that we've been able to make all these advances, but in a way we have become we have become obligated to those advances, feel a sense of responsibility to them. For instance, in transplantation, which is what I do, it's a phenomenal thing that we can do for patients. However, sometimes it's very difficult to step back and to institute in a terminal patient's case comfort measures only, because we feel that not only do we have the patient who received the liver or the organ to consider, but also the donor who donated the organ, and the person on the waiting list who potentially, theoretically, might have died because they were passed over when the organ was given to the recipient. So it makes it very, very difficult. On the other hand, I do think that we have made such advances, for instance, in the management of pain, in the management of many symptoms that patients at the end of life suffer from. And I think if we can think about that technology not just for cure, but for palliation. Right. That the technology actually opens doors for us and not just makes things more difficult for us.
One of the great things about this book is, as I said, it's got a lot of stuff about procedures and cure and the work that doctors do, but it's also very personal. And early on, you talk about your time in med school when you were dealing with a cadaver.
Yes. And
this is what you write at the end of that section or chapter. The afternoon after our final exam, I returned to the lab for one last visit with my cadaver. A laboratory technician said spent the day preparing our cadavers for shipment, but the rooms were now quiet and empty. I opened the familiar latched door underneath the lab bench and pulled out the metal bed. She was covered neatly in white plastic, ready to move to her final resting place. Through the plastic, I touched her forehead, her shoulders, and her hands, and I sat in my old jeans and high school T-shirt, thumbing through my memories of her body and the story it told us. I closed my eyes and envisioned her anatomy, referring to it as I would again innumerable times in my future practice. Thank you, I thought, feeling at that moment the strong and regular beats at the center of my own chest. Thank you for your final gift. Now, see, that's beautiful,
Thank
in my
you.
opinion, and it's very touching, and it, shows that you just didn't go there and memorize the stuff. You got it. You got it.
She gave me a tremendous gift. I do think of her when I think about anatomy, certain body parts. When I have to go and operate on somebody, her anatomy still comes to mind, and it's been 20 years.
20 years now, yeah.
But she was more than just a cadaver. She was very much my first patient. I'll never forget how I first met her. She came to us in a white body bag, like all the cadavers. And when I unzipped that bag, one of the first things I saw were her hands. And each nail had been painted with coral nail polish very carefully, but above each cuticle there was a bare rim of nail. And seeing that, we all think about, all pre-medical students know they're going to have to dissect a body.
Sure, sooner or later.
Right, and you're anxious about it. But on a certain level, you say, okay, I'll just learn the anatomy like I'm learning microbiology or immunology. But when I saw those hands, it really brought home the fact that this was another person who not that long ago was walking around like I was.
You spoke about the depersonalization of death, and the thing that I find very striking in this book is that when you throw out, something like that, which is a concept, you then almost immediately tack on to it a marvelous, unforgettable example. And the one about that I will always remember is you're observing that in the ICU, when someone dies, the medical staff goes woof away.
Yes.
That to me is absolutely incredible.
Yes, there is something that medical sociologists have referred to as the informal curriculum.
Oh my gosh. Final exams, reflections on mortality, and the physician goes beyond what it is to look at what goes beyond what is to look at what might be. And we're going to do that when we come back.
You're listening to Conversations on the Coast with Jim Foster. Now you can find this program on iTunes, SoundCloud, and all your favorite digital outlets. Follow the show on Twitter at JimFosterCoc and email JimFosterCoc@gmail.com.
This is Jim Foster, and the book we're working with this week is Final Exam, A Surgeon's Reflections on Mortality, written by Dr. Pauline W. Chen, published by Alfred Knopf, and is that a doctor, Atul?
Yes.
Atul Gawande, a fellow physician, writes, Final Exam is a revealing and heartfelt book. Pauline Chen takes us where few do, inside the feeling of practicing surgery, with its doubts, failures, and triumphs. Her tales are also uncommonly moving, most especially when contemplating death and our difficulties as doctors and patients in coming to grips with it. See, that's the great thing about the book. It doesn't shy away from what is a terribly, terribly difficult subject area for any of us to talk about, yes, especially doctors, I think. Now, one of the people leading what we might call the reform of what we've been talking about, the attitude toward death of doctors, their training, is a gentleman by the name of Hasib Ayoun. And you write about him. I have read you say Hasib's speech a dozen times, and then you quote from it. We need to devote more time and attention to teaching attitudes, skills, and behaviors at the expense of the present preoccupation and fascination with technical knowledge. Each time you write, I read these words, Hasib Ayoun reaches out to me beyond time. With dignity and unflinching candor, he tells me how I, with my own distinct future, might do it differently. And I think you would add, comma, better. No?
I hope. I don't think that I am perfect, but I do think that it's important for all of us to keep trying to talk about mortality and our end-of-life needs and what we want to do. Mm-hmm. And so I keep trying, and I think that's important for all of us to do.
Yeah, and you go into some of the actual, death situations that you've been through.
Yes.
Ones that, there's one in an ICU where you actually went back in, told the family to get out, and then you just sat there.
Yes.
And communed.
Yes.
With the person who had just died.
Yes, I think...
Which is against all regulation.
I think I was, like many doctors, was an excellent student of that informal curriculum, the depersonalization. But I was fortunate enough to have some teachers and some patients, really. The patients really taught me a lot, that made me realize, all of whom made me realize, that there was more that I could do as a doctor than just cure, that I could be a kind of empathic witness, that I could be there for them.
Only if you were willing to go and be in the shoes of the patients, as one of your early lecturers pointed out to you.
Yes. Yes.
Not an easy thing to do when you're the doctor.
It's very, very difficult. And that is what I think we should all continue to strive for. But it's very difficult. When I first heard that lecture, I thought it would be quite straightforward. Oh, yes, I can do that. In fact,
and a little shallow, I think you suggest between the lines.
Yes,
when you write about it.
Yes, yeah. But it wasn't until I had been practicing for several years that I realized just how difficult that is to do. And it's something that I think as physicians, I think it's really important to do, because I believe that the onus is on us to create an environment for patients and their families, no matter what cultural or social background they're from or individual needs, create an environment that's comfortable for them to talk about what they view as a dignified death, ask their questions, to talk with us.
You also have the courage in this book, Final Exam, to write about people who are close to you. You write about Aunt Grace.
Yes.
And then at the very end, you write about an anthropology professor from, quote, long ago, by the name of Doreen. So could you read that part of the book for us, please?
Sure.
Starting there.
We cannot remove the pain of loss. Death, whether of patients or of loved ones, will always be difficult. We can create reforms, we can institute policy changes, and we can even write books. But our professional fear and aversion to dying is the most difficult and most fundamentally human obstacle in changing end-of-life care. Our grief is the price we pay for caring for the terminally ill, and our aversion is the weight that anchors our inertia and our denial. Through the many phone calls and emails in which I would try to help Doreen, I realized that all those reform efforts could not mitigate my grief. 10 excruciating days later, the results of much additional testing revealed that the mass in Doreen's liver was a rare benign tumor. She wrote me, "I can't thank you enough. You've been instrumental in helping me get back my life. If anything, this has taught me how precious friends are. Thank you for the inexpressibly touching and life-giving gift of your friendship. It's wonderful to have friends who, as they say in Japanese, do me the honor of worrying about me." That honor of worrying, of caring, of easing suffering, of being present, may be our most important task, not only as friends, but as physicians too. And when we are finally capable of that, we will have become true healers.
The voice, Dr. Pauline Chen. The book, Final Exam, A Surgeon's Reflections on Mortality. This has been Conversations on the Coast, and I'm Jim Foster.
Now you can find this program on iTunes, SoundCloud, and all your favorite digital outlets. Follow the show on Twitter at JimFosterCoc and email jimfostercoc@gmail.com.